Hello,
Hey,
how are you?
good. How are you?
Good.
I'm Henry, and thank you so much again for taking the time to talk. I really do appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure.
How's life? First of all, how's everything going? Been busy?
All's good. Yeah, I've been busy, just working, finishing up a number of things and getting ready to start new projects, and it's all fun.
Yeah, good. I mean, the thing I always am curious about is how people get started. And so, how was it that you got into the world of music? Was that something that you had wanted to do since you were a kid and you stumbled into it, or stumbled into composing? Like, what was your process of getting into music, especially for a career?
Well, I had a different career for the first half of my adult life. First half of my career, first like 15 years really. I was in a rock band and we made records and toured all in the 90s. And, it wasn't until like 2008 that I decided that I wanted to try something different. And, I stumbled into writing music for narrative, for picture, and for storytelling. Um, but it was sort of a natural progression, I think, for me. It was something that made sense to me, like how to tell stories, how to turn music into emotional like motivation.
Hmm.
And that so when I was hanging out at my friend's studio who did this kind of thing, working on in narrative media, um, I what I realized is it was very interesting to me and it seemed like something I could do. So I just started, you know, writing with them and writing for them and trying to figure out like I would turn that into um how I would turn that into doing something on my own, you know?
Was it were In terms of doing that, were you familiar with film and TV music that much, or was it a huge learning process of doing that
Well,
first project?
I was aware of film music. I loved E.T. score. I loved, Star Wars and all the big movie scores that you think of when you think of very memorable music in movies. Um, Even more importantly, one of the scores that I most sort of um, was influenced by, not influenced in terms of what I do, but influenced in terms of what I wanted to do, um, was Brokeback Mountain.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
Gustavo's score, blending acoustic instruments, acoustic guitar and pedal steel and all that with strings and all that emotion was something that I was very attracted to, in terms of like what type of music I really liked. So when I heard that score, I was like, oh wow, I didn't know you could do that. Like I didn't know you could do that with an acoustic guitar. Um, and I mean, it turns out that I don't typically use guitars, even though was my main instrument in my band for a very long time. I don't typically write scores with guitars in it, but that was a score that was very, I think, instrumental in making me want to pursue a career as a composer of music for film, TV.
Yeah.
Mm.
And in terms of, and we can go ahead and talk about it, but the blending of the natural and the like electronic things, like what projects, because you've done things like sci-fi stuff like Altered Carbon, and then you've done things like Ripley or the new show Zero Day. So how do you go about, getting on a project? Is the choice to blend the different kinds of instruments totally you, or is that something that you're having conversations about that someone is telling you like, hey, maybe let's have this mix up of the sound as opposed to you purely? Like what are those conversations like, or are there any conversations at all when dealing
Well,
with the blending of
so
those things?
here's the thing. When you're working in film and television or video games, everything you do is a collaboration. Like the entire idea of writing music to help tell a story is a collaboration with the filmmaker. So there's a director or there's a writer, there's a, showrunner or whatever. Um, and we sit down and talk about what they want to feel. And then it's my job to sort of translate that into music. And sometimes there are very descriptive conversations about how somebody may not want any um human sounding instruments in the score. They might want it to be all electronic because that's the kind of vibe that they're trying to get. Um, typically typically we don't talk about like what does the score sound like actually sound like. It's
Hmm.
how is it going to be utilized to make the audience feel what we want them to feel, how am I going to use music to help enhance and tell the story? Sometimes that's just a solo guitar or solo violin. Sometimes it's a big orchestra. Sometimes it's orchestral and electronic instruments put together. Sometimes it's all electronic instruments. I think that, I typically use music to define emotional context for any story. And the instruments that I use are sort of just a part of that magic, right? Like
Hmm.
I have had conversations with Noah Hawley, for instance, about like, oh, can we really give this part a more growly electronic feel? And then I do that, right? Um, but sometimes there's no conversation about that. The conversation is just, well, we're really trying to enhance this emotional aspect of the show or this emotional aspect of the film. Um, that's what we're looking for. And then I'm left to decide like what that sounds like.
Yeah.
So it's really like there's no one way that goes about happening.
Yeah. And then talking about Noah Hawley's shows, so you've worked on, Fargo, Legion. I mean, he's an incredible writer, creator. And what, in terms of something like Fargo, because that's an anthology series, so different settings and storylines and all that stuff, how do you go about, are you thinking, okay, I want to have things carried over from each season that are little subtle notes and stuff? Or is it each time you get a season, you're like, all right, completely clean slate? Like how are you keeping it both, I guess, kind of similar, maybe in theory, but also making it a different sound because you want to have each season stand alone?
Well, that's melodic. That's a melodic issue. Like, what are the new themes for the new seasons? And that's sort of what we've been talking about doing for the last 5 seasons. It's like each season it gets a unique set of thematic material, but the feel of the score is the same. You
Yeah.
know, is one in Fargo specifically, there is one theme that has transferred from season to season to season, and that's the bad guy drum beat, right? Which began as a drum kit in season one. It got more drum line in season two. It got more orchestral in season three, but the beat itself recurs in all the seasons. Other than that, and the fact that we use the original Fargo movie theme once every season, those are the two things that uh, that sort of transition from one season to the next. The rest of it is basically, like what are the new feelings? What are the new melodies? And every season I try to incorporate the sound of the show into the score. So like in this last season, I utilized a lot of kitchen utensils in the sound of the score. And I
Mhm.
did that because, our main character, when she gets in her own head, she starts making pancakes and she's, doing stuff in the kitchen. In season three, the brothers, they were, or the one of the brothers was involved in parking lots, owner of parking lots. So I utilized sounds of cars, windshield wipers and horns and door slamming and that kind of thing. In season two, there was a typewriter. Season one, it was the washer and dryer. Like I have tried to incorporate the sound of the actual story into the score. That's also a way that I try to delineate the sound of each season.
Yeah, and I can imagine that would be pretty. I mean, of course, there's nothing wrong, or I'm sure it's very exciting to do seasons that are, kind of linear, consecutive, but I think it would be interesting to be like, okay, well, I have a totally new set of characters. I can just kind of go crazy with, hey, what could I do today for this season? 'Cause as last season is last season. Now I'm on to this one. So I feel like that would be a pretty interesting thing and exciting as an artist.
It's definitely exciting as an artist, and it makes it more interesting to me than to do season seven.
Hmm.
So that's the same thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, to me, that's less interesting. The most interesting part, the most fun I have for any project is in the first month or two when I'm figuring out what it is.
Yeah.
That's the most fun for me.
And then talking about shows that do have season to season. So you've become, I mean, I think one of the more foundational composers with this new Star Trek
Mm,
universe, all these Paramount Plus shows and then including Section 31 that just recently came out. What
mm.
was the process of getting on to Star Trek? And then was it intimidating because it's so huge, not only because of its fan base, but because there have been so many iterations of it? What was the process of, okay, I want to make it feel like Star Trek, but also I want to do my own thing? Like, was it overwhelming at first, or did it just feel like another project, in terms of the same kind of creation?
Certainly it was overwhelming.
Mhm.
Like certainly it's a tall task to be put in a situation where you are now standing next to all of these great composers. There's a long line of composers that are of an unbelievable quality and echelon of
Right.
composers who worked in Star Trek universe. So I wasn't really worried about having to be, wanting to sound like Star Trek, but also wanting to have it be my own thing. Anything I do is going to have me in it, right? Like there's nothing I can do about that. I can't be or sound like someone else. I can only be what I am.
Hmm.
So, the trick was how do we come up with a sound and a theme and a vibe that is familiar in Star Trek and yet also unique. So that's the real trick. I always knew like Star Trek has a very orchestral sound generally. So we're definitely going to use an orchestra. In Section 31, there was a little more swagger in our main character. And because it's the story that has not really been told, I had a little more leeway in doing some newer sounds. So I added a little bit of rock guitar, I added a little bit of drums, I added a little bit of a little bit of swagger. And I thought that worked pretty well for the character of Georgiou, who is very sort of swaggery, tongue in cheek, and messes with people. And I thought, how fun would it be for the score to do the same thing? Um, you know, I think that the idea is as I do more and more Star Trek, um, the idea is how do I figure out how to keep it fresh without it sounding tired, without it sounding like, oh, we've done that before.
Yeah. And one thing I'm curious about with because I've talked to composers before about it are because obviously you're writing music then and recording everything like that, but are your days when you get onto a project like let's say Fargo or Star Trek, are your work days always pretty long? Like are there days where almost like a screenwriter where you're kind of just sitting there thinking of things, or are your days always kind of busy? Like what is your
Mm.
kind of typical work day, even like length of a day, look like when you're on a big project? Do you usually, when it comes to a season, do you have a good amount of time, or is it sometimes you're kind of crammed for time?
There's nothing typical about a work. Um, it's different every day. It's different every time. So sometimes it's busy doing stuff like writing cues. Sometimes it's trying to figure out what the sound of something is. Sometimes it's writing big themes. Sometimes I'm just answering emails all day. Sometimes I'm just being on the phone talking to people. Um, you know, Sometimes my days are long, sometimes my days are short. There are days where I don't write a single note of music, but I have spent the entire day thinking about music. Like, what is this going to be? And tinkering with a sound or tinkering with a new synthesizer. You know what I mean? Like, it could
Mhm.
be it could be anything. That's why I say there's nothing typical about any workday for someone who's trying to be creative, because some days you're able to just sit and do the work, and that's very skilled. That's a very skilled thing. And sometimes you're just trying to imagine what it is you're going to do. And that's where sort of the art comes into play. So, a lot of time is spent trying to merge those two sides of my brain.
Yeah.
Mm,
And one recent show that I wanted to make sure to touch on was Ripley, which is
mm,
the Netflix
yeah.
limited series. And so somehow I missed when that show came out, and I just happened to come across it, and I thought it was really one of the most like beautiful, meticulous shows, excuse me, that I've seen in ages. And it's black and white. It's very, classic noir. And it just completely, with your music included, really just blew me away. I really didn't know what to expect. And it was a masterful series, I think. And so what was the process of, because it does feel very typical noir, but at the same time, it does feel fresh. It's even though it's black and white and it has the classic film noir sounds in your music, there's still that modern sensibility too.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Zalian is a very exceptional filmmaker, and he has an attention, an eye, and an attention for detail that outmatches anybody I know. It's just he's he's incredible that way. So what I would say is like the time that we had to make that really did give us all the opportunity to operate at our highest level, right? We paid attention to every single frame of the show, and that's how we were able to come to that. Like I wrote and rewrote stuff many, many times in order to get it just right. And that to me is very in line with how he likes to make things. The thing I love about the filmmakers that I get to work with are, we're all making all this stuff by hand, like we are really diving deep into it and have our hands on every aspect of the art and the craft that we're involved with. So, when you have filmmakers that work like that, it inspires everyone who's in their orbit to work like that. And I think, that was, Ripley is the combination of everybody who's involved with the project working at their highest possible capacity.
Yeah. And it maybe is a cheesy question, but I think I'm always curious. So with you having done it for so long, are there any, looking back, are there any certain experiences, any certain moments, anything that you feel like your younger self would have liked to have known, or maybe not even that, just now being older, thinking, all right, I want to make sure to always remember to do this, or is there anything that stands out as that was a really good learning lesson for me in whatever respect?
Yeah, and I would say that the one thing that I've sort of come to realize is if you're doing an all-nighter, you're doing something wrong. And and that I'm very serious about that.
Hmm.
There is
Sure.
absolutely no reason to have to stay up all night. Like, because by the time you get to 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever you're doing is shit. Like, it's
Yeah.
not gonna be good. There's no way it's gonna be good. Like, it's just not, because you just don't operate. I mean, unless you're the type of person who only works at night, in which case you're sleeping all day. I know people like that, and that's not what I'm talking about. Like, for most of us normal people, sleep at night and work during the day, at whatever time. Some people like to work early, some people like to work later. My point is to go past 14 hours of work in a day, or to go past 16 hours of work in a day, you're never going to you're never going to accomplish what you think you are accomplishing, other than to have something finished at the end of that time. And it's usually not good. And so I would say, like, I've learned on a number of occasions that there's no schedule. I mean, that's not true. There are some, but it's very rare that you have to do that or else the world is going to end. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, it doesn't typically happen. So I would say if I could go back 15 years, because I've been doing this for about 15 years or a little less than that. Um, if I could go back to the beginning, I would say, you know what? Like when you get to 11 o'clock and you're tired, just go to sleep. Wake up and do it early in the morning and you'll
Yeah.
feel much better. That's
Yeah.
what I, it's nothing too major, right? It's nothing too like mind blowing or artistic in nature. It's like just listen to yourself.
Yeah, no, I get that totally. Are there any, and on top of that, were there any early projects that you felt like either had the hugest impact on you in terms of like, hey, I'm actually doing this, for a living now, I'm getting started and I'm learning. Were there any certain projects or anything like that that really have stuck with you more than maybe more so than others, just in terms of, hey, that's where I started and this is where I am now.
It's interesting. I would say all projects that I work on stick with me.
Sure.
Everything. From the very first thing I ever got hired to do as the lead composer, which was a show called The Unusuals it was Noah Hawley's first show. And he hired me. From that, um, to Zero Day, which was the last thing I was working on. Um, you know, I would say it all sticks with me and it's all important. And I learn something new from every project that I work on. And I learn something new every time I work with a new filmmaker or every time I work with a filmmaker that I've worked with in the past. It's like the entirety of what I love to do is to learn new things.
Hmm.
And when being able to write music, um, as a means to support myself, like that's an incredible journey to be on. And I want to be able to learn and do better every time.
Yeah. And when you, because I'm one thing I'm curious about with composers, because I'll hear about them saying, oh well, I got this instrument from Africa. I went and did this, or I went and got this. Like if you're wanting to try out a new sound, a new instrument, whatever, what's the process of you actually thinking about it and then getting that instrument, that sound system, whatever? Like, is there anything like I'm always curious, how do you go from thinking it to actually finding a new sound? Like, are you in communication with the lots of people? Are you doing stuff on your own to get these new sounds? Like, how do you go about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always looking out for new, interesting instruments, people who make bespoke instruments, people who make new synthesizers, people who make new, acoustic instruments. Um, and I'm always like on the like message boards and watching YouTube videos and just having an open mind to things. And occasionally you see something that's really great. And when I do, I see it, I buy it, I use it, I record it and see if it works. One of the greatest gifts that I have gotten is the ability to do that, to see something or hear something, to get it and try it. Because that's the learning part.
Yeah. Because yeah, I'm always like the people I've talked to in the past, they're like, oh yeah, here's this random instrument I found like online, or like I traveled here, like across the country or whatever to get this thing. I'm like, how did you get that? Like, how did you find this? But I mean, in like the coolest way. It's like, hey, like you just found this random thing that makes the score very unique.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Just keeping your eyes open, your ears open, your
Yeah.
heart open,
Yeah.
and like just looking in the right places.
Well, what about one of the last things? What about um since we talked about your work days, what's something that you like to do either when you're done with work for that day or when you're off that does help you decompress? Like what are things that help you get your mind back again? Do you listen to a lot of music when you're not working since you're making music all day? Like are you I guess, and so what's your relationship to music, I guess, outside of work as well?
I love music. So I don't typically listen to like film scores, if that's what you're saying, because I'm doing that all the time. I don't typically watch television much because I'm doing that so much at the studio, but I do love to see movies. I do love to watch movies. Um, but I would say like the things that I really, really enjoy doing, making and drinking coffee.
Oh yeah.
the love of mine. I have a pretty fancy machine that I like to. Can I consider myself a barista of the highest magnitude? Um, and I've done a lot of research into like what makes a really good coffee, what makes a really good espresso, how do you get the perfect pull, how do you get the perfect steamed milk, how do you do a cappuccino versus a flat white versus a latte versus a macchiato versus all these things. So these are just things that I love because I really like drinking coffee. Now, at the end of the day, I drink black coffee, so I don't.
Mm.
So I'm always wanting to make other people coffee. I love
Mm.
cooking. I like to cook. I spent a lot of time being a professional cook as a means to make a living before I was making a living as a musician. So that always really intrigues me.
Well, just to say, I was a barista at a local shop for about 10 years.
Wow.
So if we're ever meet in person, I can, we can make some coffee because I'm
Yeah.
yeah, I trained for did that for years and I learned about every kind of coffee. So yeah. And I'm a huge coffee nut anyways, regardless, but
Yeah.
well, Jeff, as I've said, I really thank you very much for speaking with me. I am a huge and my wife, we are both huge fans of the projects that you've been a part of, including your music, because they're a very essential part. And so I
Thank
just
you.
really wanted to thank you for the amazing work that you've done across so many different things. And I hope to speak to you again sometime soon. But thank you very much for being here and taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the intelligent and thoughtful questions. It's always it's always a pleasure to talk about the art and the process.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, yeah, we'll be in touch and yeah, I hope you just take care and I speak to you again soon, okay?
Thank you very much, and it was nice to meet you.